Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Olga Cherevko, the spokesperson for the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Gaza. She has spent the last 20 years working in conflict zones as a humanitarian and communications professional. She has worked in Liberia, Afghanistan, Philippines, Gaza, Somalia, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Olga holds a Master's of Arts degree in Political Science from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. I welcome Olga Cherevko to Savage Minds. Olga, I'm very happy to have you on the show. I've been following your work and your photography for some time, and I wanted to start off today by asking you how your experience growing up on military bases in Siberia and that kind of isolated upbringing shape your resilience for the humanitarian front lines in Gaza.
Good question. I think what it has given me is this kind of independence and a sense that I can kind of just start over, no matter where I am, and having to move all the time, and my dad getting reassigned every couple of years. I had to basically arrive and start from scratch in every new place. There's a new school, new friends, new environment, new climate. And so I think it kind of prepared me for my future career, not only in Gaza, but of course, Gaza was kind of the culmination of everything that I've done to date. And arriving there and just kind of starting from scratch, because even though I had spent 3 years prior in Gaza, this war has changed it to an unrecognizable degree, obviously, and just getting there and having to figure out my way, because I was part of a very, very small team at the time. We were only a team of 4. And even though everyone arrived with the expectation of doing a specific terms of reference function, it quickly changed. We realized very, very quickly that it basically we had to do everything together all at once. And it's not. It was not limited. My role was not limited to communication. It was negotiating access. It was doing protection. It was coordination and many, many other things that just simply kind of had to happen because everything was just so chaotic and so unpredictable, let's say.
You worked in Gaza before. I think it was in 2014. And then you described Gaza as a wasteland and a shell of itself. How has the physical landscape changed most drastically since when you first worked there?
Well, 2014 was obviously at that time, it had the longest escalation to date since 2005, when Hamas took over. And, when I arrived, there were some areas of Gaza that were quite badly damaged. And of course, there were previous escalations in 2006 and 2008 and so forth in 2010 that had left their mark. But what I saw in 2024, when I arrived, of course, it was really beyond description. I mean, it was so shocking. And, and the war had just started. It had only been going on for a couple of months. But already, and back then, when I came on the 2nd of January, actually, 2024, and we entered through Rafah, and already I could see that the scale of destruction was unparalleled. And of course, 2 years later, we are now looking at most of Gaza virtually erased from the face of the earth.
Yes, in fact, I lived in Jerusalem and the West Bank. I worked on a project on the first 5 female suicide bombers during the Second Intifada. And I've been thinking of your work recently in relationship to my own work many years ago, because you spoke of, at one point, I recall, people just waiting to die. And I remember that the impetus for my first starting my project and going to the West Bank to study both sides of the then conflict of the Second Intifada, it was in a way to approach this pain and the fact that people were then not only waiting to die, they were killing themselves in the name of trying to effect some kind of justice. I found out very quickly the reason why people were blowing themselves up. And it wasn't necessarily that they wanted to die, it was more to the point of they had nothing left to live for. And in your recent reports, you mentioned people stating that they just wanted to
Mhm.
die. I would like to know if you could talk a bit about what specific interactions led you to this devastating conclusion.
Well, obviously, I think the kind of dynamics in Gaza between people and the thoughts that were going through their head and the kind of what they were expressing ebbed and flowed throughout the conflict and throughout this particular war, actually. And so, if we were in a ceasefire period, they may have been a bit more hopeful. If the ceasefire broke down, we went back to hostilities, and that the kind of light of hope that I saw became less and less bright as the war continued. And the reason I said that Gaza has become a shell of itself is because that light of hope was being extinguished, and less I would see people, the light in people's eyes. It just literally just dimmed, and I would talk to people, and they would tell me less and less that there is hope, or we hope that the war will be over. They A lot of times they would just tell me, I don't want to continue this because it just seems like there is no end. And something always seems to happen to make it even worse. And this is something that I always used to say, that every time, every month, I would come to Gaza and I would be like, we have hit rock bottom. There's no way it can get worse than it has already. And then somehow it would get much worse, and it continued to get worse. And then obviously now I think it has a potential to become even worse than it is, because it has disappeared from people's minds and from the screens, and people kind of probably forgot about it in many ways.
The level of devastation that is going on in Gaza is tremendous. In fact, way back when I was in the West Bank, Gaza had just been blocked off just weeks before. I couldn't get there. In fact, we were aware that it made the West Bank look like a picnic from all the media reports of what was happening
Mhm.
in Gaza. And this is devastating in itself because the West Bank was horrific during the Second Intifada. Just to travel, and you know this from living in the region, just to travel from Jerusalem to Bethlehem is an extremely fast voyage for those taking
Yeah.
Egged buses. It can be hours and even a day-long excursion to go a simple 15, 20 minutes for Israelis. I stayed so many times with families that I had gone to interview because there was no possible way I could interview them without missing my collective taxi back to Jerusalem in time. And I don't think most Westerners understand this situation that you have also
Mhm.
documented. You've documented the children wading knee deep in water in their tent camps. How is the lack of basic infrastructure like sanitation and drainage impacting long term health in these areas? And what other kinds of effects from the last many years can you discuss in terms of health and sanitation resulting from the genocide and the acts of terror in Gaza?
Well, this exact issue, the vast, overwhelming destruction of basic critical civilian infrastructure, which of course includes water and sanitation and healthcare and this kind of thing, it has now created this issue that rebuilding or any kind of rehabilitation, it has to be on such a massive scale to really make a difference, that we just, as humanitarians, we feel a lot of times that we're just treading water, because every time we fix a pipe, another pipe breaks. And then, because we cannot bring the type of supplies that we need, we have to fit wrong, a different diameter pipe to fix the leak. And then that doesn't last. And then we have to bring more water trucks, and then we have to do more with this. But it's always these kind of creative solutions that, of course, we make it work because this is what we do and this is our job. But to rehabilitate it, you have to rebuild the entire infrastructure. And of course, the lack of sanitation, the lack of water, the lack of hygiene, and of course, the issues that we had with bringing hygiene supplies for the longest time, and even chlorinating chlorine for the water to disinfect it. It means that people who are living in these overcrowded sites and shelters, they are basically overrun by every possible waterborne disease, by vermin, by rat infestations. There's lice, there is fleas, there is all kinds of things that are just really unpleasant and obviously dangerous, and they spread disease, and it's just it continues to kind of layer itself and make the situation even more dire for the people.
Can you describe the spirit of the Palestinian people you've met and how they managed to offer tea, biscuits, and a smile in such extreme deprivation? Or has that all gone now?
No, it's definitely not gone. I think this is something that will always, I don't think it can be broken, to be honest. I have a very, very close friend whom I've known since 2014, and I mention him a lot in my stories and in my writings. And he's kind of my barometer for the spirit of the Palestinians. And there have been times where I would see that light gone from his eyes, but then it would just take a day or two or three for him to pick himself up and call me again and say, you know what, I'm back on track, and I'm going to I'm going to feed everyone in Gaza who is hungry. And this is his passion, and this is what he's been doing throughout this war. And he somehow, after displacement after displacement after displacement, um, after getting his house destroyed and everything, losing all of his things, and losing loved ones and family members, um, he finds the strength, and he continues. And this is, for me, it was the most. It kept my strength up, because there were times where I would actually be completely hopeless, and I would go to him and I would start crying, and he would tell me, "You have to be strong like us, Olga." And he would say, "Don't cry."
Honestly, Olga, I don't know how you do it because when I got back from the West Bank, I had to go back to my psychoanalyst in New York. I was full of rage. Just quick background, but I grew up in Canada and then from the age of 10 in the deep south. And I mean Louisiana, Mississippi, deep south of the late 70s and early 80s. And I have never before in my life seen such racism as I have in Israel, without an
Yeah.
exaggeration. And then add to that the devastation that you end up having to
Mm.
adapt to constantly, because at one point you said, I cannot take any more deaths. I've lost too many loved
Yeah.
ones. This is something I completely can relate to. And I'm wondering, how do you process the grief while remaining the professional voice of OCHA?
Well, I think for the longest time I didn't, and it's something that just kind of becomes background noise because everything else takes precedence, and you kind of push it inside and you don't think about it, because you don't have time to think about it when you're there. I think, I remember many times we would be coming back from very difficult missions where we would see really traumatic things, and in the morning we'd be going and we'd be chatting with each other and joking maybe, and then the entire drive back would be in complete silence, because I think everybody would just be so overwhelmed by what they had seen, but nobody was ready to talk about it. And it's not some it was never something that I thought about when I was there, but it's always something that eventually hits you when you leave. And and it's sometimes really unplanned and unexpected, but eventually you do have to face it, and process it somehow. But it's I think I'm still trying to figure out how to do that fully. But yeah, it's definitely not something that even crosses your mind when you're there, because there's just too many things that are happening that you have to take care of.
Well, I would even say that your Instagram captures such hauntingly beautiful moments amidst the rubble. I would guess that photography, in a sense, also
Mm.
helps you deal with it all.
Yeah, definitely. This is something that I have really kind of found a, a passion for, let's say, because it is something that somebody said to me not so long ago, is that well, what are you going to take pictures of? Just destroyed buildings. But like I have found a way, I think, to actually to maybe portray hope through these images, because it's not just a bombed out building. If there's sun shining through it, or if there's a person smiling next to it, it just gives you some sort of sense of hope, which is something that I always said that if I lost that entirely, I would have left Gaza long ago.
And you've stated nothing is normal here. Many people don't understand the brutality of conflict zones in general if they've not been in one. Gaza is beyond the pale of what one might call a conflict zone. So I'm wondering if you might describe a single day in your life in Gaza City or in Gaza in general that would shock someone listening coming from a stable environment.
Sure. I mean, there are. I think maybe one of the things that I remember was actually just when the during the previous ceasefire, when it took effect. I remember going to North Gaza, so the northernmost governorate of the Gaza Strip, which of course is one of the most heavily destroyed areas in Gaza. I mean, some of the area, it's like Rafah, where there's some areas where you cannot even fathom that there was life at some point, of any kind, because it's just it's but at this point, it's been not only just the buildings were destroyed, but they were also bulldozed over, and there's just no sign of life of any kind. And the Jabalia and Beit Hanun and Beit Lahia, some of these areas, they looked so desolate before the ceasefire. And when the ceasefire took effect and people started to return immediately, and we would come to these areas, and literally 3 days before, I would be there where there was not a soul in sight, and you would just drive through these bombed out shells of residential buildings, and there'd be no one inside, and there'd be no one around, and it'd just be very, very eerie. And of course, sometimes there would be military equipment around us, and forces on the ground. And then when the ceasefire took place, we would go to northern Gaza, and you would see these really kind of jarring images of people setting up shelters in the middle of just complete destruction, and just really pretending like setting up shops. And it would get so tight, where because on both sides of you there would be just ruins and rubble, and they would set up shops just next to these ruins. And then, we would try to get through this narrow street of very busy kind of marketplace, and people constructing their tents, and kids running around and playing. And the one thing that stuck with me always is the sound. If I would be inside and I would be listening to sounds outside, this kind of normality that eventually became commonplace, of sounds of children playing and laughing and running around, and explosions going off, and the children just continuing as if they're they're not even there. These explosions, that they became so accustomed to them that they would just continue laughing and running around, and it would just be this juxtaposition of these two sounds that for me never became quite normal, but obviously for the children they have.
When you mention the gentleman who regained the light in his eyes, I have to wonder about the parents who've lost their children. And this is the one thing we don't see reported in the media. And I've been there. I lost my first child. I honestly don't know how these parents go on living. And in my case, I didn't have to face the possibility of everyone else around me being mowed down or in danger of imminent death because we're in the wrong place at the wrong time or a missile hit our house. Because what is happening with all the parents who have lost their children there? And we don't see the reports of them very much, except at the moment of their child's death. So I'm wondering what is happening with these parents who have lost their children.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the things that maybe is not talked as much about, is the mental impact and the psychological impact of this war on both the parents and the children, and everybody who has survived this war. And I think, like, I've heard people say that the ones who have been killed are maybe luckier than the survivors. Um, the Because that you can rebuild a building, and you can um, rebuild a school and then a hospital, and rehabilitate a water network, but it's much more difficult to get to heal a person from the mental trauma. And obviously, there's always, of course, the physical trauma and the amputees, and the kind of life-changing impact that's had. But the mental trauma is, when I would go, I saw this first in 2014, when we would go to schools and we would look at, they would have like children's drawings on the walls, displayed, and these drawings, they weren't normal children's drawings. They were um, showing, body parts strewn around a street, and blood, and tanks and fighter jets throwing bombs. And, it was very obvious that already, even during that war, we always talked about the mental impact. And the parents, you mentioned the parents losing their children. I mean, it's something that I always think about as well. We've had to pick up bodies of teenagers who, I don't know uh, how long they had been missing at the time that we would find them, but like, what would go through the mother's mind, who had maybe sent out her child for firewood or food or whatever, to sit there and wait until the news came. And there was there was a there was a there was a shelter last year in Gaza City, where I was introduced to a woman who had been in shock for over a year. She never came out of the shock, and she basically, she saw her son be, get killed in front of her eyes. And she basically went into this like deep state of shock, and she could only, like, she just can only scream and um, make kind of, uh, like mumbling sounds, and she doesn't recognize most of her family anymore. So, it's something that obviously I don't have first hand experience with, but something that I always think about how these parents and many of them I think didn't have time to process it during the war. And maybe I saw this also during the last ceasefire, where people were kind of like shell shocked coming out, and only just then starting to process the grief, and a lot of it would hit them all at once.
I'm heartbroken. I mean, I'm not surprised, of course. It's just the typical legacy media coverage, which has been spectacularly pathetic on the issue, calling it, of course, Israel's right to self defense or trying to weaponize and incriminate UN bodies. You've emphasized that aid is currently at pre ceasefire levels, and we saw a lot of the kind of politicization that Israel was doing in terms of allowing food in. So, what specific bottlenecks are preventing a full scale up of the aid?
Well, what we've always kind of tried to steer away from is the question that because if you just look at the number of trucks, it's many is allowed are not allowed to enter, or are very very difficult to get clearance to enter. And these types of supplies are exactly the solutions that we need to have a more sustainable kind of approach to the destruction. So exactly what I was talking about, these fittings, these spare parts, for us to repair the infrastructure in a way that will make sure that it doesn't break the next day, or that it lasts, and that allows us to not just give out tents to people, because they've lived in these horrific conditions for over 2 years now, um, but to be able to repair the shelters that are still left, to repair the homes that are still left. So we would need timber, we would need concrete, we would need tool and things like that. But those are very, very difficult to get through and to get approved. Same thing with rubble. There's millions and millions of tons of rubble that needs to be cleared, and if we had the heavy machinery to clear it faster, we could free up more space and more land, because availability of land, of course, in a place like Gaza is extremely critical. It's a tiny place to begin with. It was already quite crowded, and one of the more densely populated areas, Gaza City. Even before the war, that now land scarcity is even more pronounced. So we need these supplies, but they are restricted. They're considered dual use, and they take multiple layers of approval. A lot of times they get rejected, and then also the fact that we don't have all the crossings open at the moment. The crossings are closed completely because of we're not able to bring any supplies at all at the moment, and so but when before the crossings, the latest closure of the crossings into Gaza, not all the crossings were operating, and the ones, everything has to get scanned through Kerem Shalom, and so that's a very limited kind of scanning ability, and a lot of cargo that comes from Egypt, for example, gets turned away. There's a lot of congestion in Kerem Shalom, and so cargo gets again turned around and sent back because they just cannot process it quickly enough. And then of course the conditions inside, the roads that are destroyed, the hostilities that are still happening, the strikes that are still happening in various parts of Gaza. All of these factors, they have a play.
The additional border crossings and the reopening of them seems to be the only viable way to prevent widespread famine. Why are they not yet open? And of course, we've all been told that there's a ceasefire, which it's not a complete ceasefire. Are these two related?
I don't know if they're related. What I know is that we, of course, have always called for additional crossings to be open and for these additional capacities to be installed and in place for us to be able to have unimpeded and sustained access, and to make sure that we can bring the things that we need to bring. And, obviously, since this current ceasefire, we have been able to expand a lot and scale up activities and bring a lot more assistance than we were able to do before. But again, as I said, we're not at the level we need to be. And the types of supplies, many types of supplies that are considered dual use, um, are preventing us from applying these more sustainable solutions.
Has the Israeli government made it more difficult for aid agencies despite the ceasefire?
Well, there, of course, there are many restrictions that are in place. There are the different registration issues with the NGOs. There are the dual use items, again, the restrictions on them, and the various processes that we have to go through, and the different stages of approval, and the still, the rejections that end up happening, that prevent us from bringing them. And then there's also the rejections of staff, the rejection of medical personnel, and things like this that are preventing us from being able to operate in a more scale, to scale up faster, let's say, and to be able to save more lives.
And beyond food and medicine, what unfettered supplies like fuel or cooking gas are most critical for survival right now?
So it's these things that I mentioned that are that would enable us to rehabilitate the infrastructure um, that would allow us to restore water networks and sanitation networks, and really address the issue of these living conditions where that we can clear up more space to establish dignified shelters, so people aren't living on top of each other, and we can resolve the issues of sanitation and these waterborne diseases and these kinds of um, vermin infestations and these things. Shelter, of course, is a huge issue, and it keeps coming up as a critical need. Because obviously most of the population remains displaced, and it will be God knows how long before they're actually able to have some sort of a lasting shelter. Even though there is, of course, a lot more food entering, and there's pretty much you can buy anything you want in the market, and a lot of things are accessible, they remain unaffordable to people who have been out of work, which is most of people, for these 2+ years, and of course, um, the pace of response remains slower than we would like it to be.
Well, certainly, even before the war, the ability for people to be employed in places like the West Bank was devastatingly lowered when they started to build the wall.
Exactly.
And people also don't understand that while you have this on the one hand, you also have this kind of stereotype of the macho Muslim man on the other. It's like, no, these men were actually left jobless. They were left without any possibility of dreaming of a present, much less a future. And so, unlike us in the West, many of us are raised to have dreams and hopes, irrespective of class, in fact. These men in the West Bank had none of that. In fact, they know that because of the idea of crackdowns in certain neighborhoods and certain towns, there are men who simply cannot leave. So I think that's another thing that Westerners do not seem to understand, the larger ramifications of spending your entire life not only unemployed, but unemployable because it's not even a concept on the table.
Mm.
So I wanted to ask you about what you think about the claims that aid operations are being weaponized through restrictive registration rules.
Mm. Well, I mean, this is something that we're obviously facing, and this is something that we have spoken out a lot against to make sure that our NGO partners are able to operate because without their support and without their contribution, we simply would not be able to provide the response that we're providing now. Um, we, as the UN, we cannot fill that gap. We don't have that capacity. I mean, if you look at just field hospitals alone, NGO partners are supporting 60% of field hospitals. They are they provide the majority of support in just about every area that we work on, in terms of food and nutrition and healthcare and the supplies that are in the pipeline for shelter. They are mainly NGO supplies. So this is a big issue for us, and of course, any kind of restrictions on the ability of NGO partners or any other aid organizations to operate would have a detrimental effect on the overall result.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. You've stated that the situation cannot be resolved just through humanitarian assistance. What other political or bilateral actions are necessary to better the situation on the ground?
Well, we have always said this, that we as humanitarians cannot do this work alone. We need the international community on board. We need, ultimately, what needs to happen is to get Gaza back to a state where people can provide for themselves. Right now, the majority of the population depends on humanitarian assistance. But of course, we're also talking about ultimately political solutions that provide um, a resolution to the conflict, that allow for the possibility of a two-state solution, that allow for a possibility of Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in peace. So these are the types of solutions that are needed, because humanitarian assistance, we can hand out packages all we want, but unless there is a proper and meaningful political solution at hand, this will just be another wave or another one of these situations where wave after wave of escalation will continue to happen.
Having worked for UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, also called UNRWA, from 2014 to 2017, how does the current crisis compare to previous periods of conflict you've witnessed?
It doesn't compare. It doesn't. It's again, I think it's the impact. It's the level of trauma. It is the kind of the daily trauma that has been witnessed by the people experiencing it um, in their daily lives. It is this severe destruction of infrastructure, both in terms of residential buildings, but also the networks that will take years and years to rebuild. And of course, the amount of rubble that I've mentioned before, and it's just it's a compounded problem that has been collecting over time, and this has made it in many ways really unprecedented, because to now to think about how long it will take to actually restore and to rehabilitate and to rebuild and to really address the problem, the fact that the kids have been out of school for close to 3 years now, and we are talking about this again compounded impact that will reflect in the many years to come. that you cannot compare those two. And you know what I always I think as human beings, I think the brain, our brain tries to protect us as much as it can when traumatic things happen and when we experience these things. What I always remember is that if you ask any person from Gaza about what life was like before this war started, they will tell you that actually it was perfect. It was idyllic. It was they could go out to eat, they could go to school, they could do everything that they really wanted. Um, and in many ways, I feel like they had blocked out the trauma that happened before, because when I arrived in 2014, we already at that point we talked about how soon Gaza will be unlivable because of these restrictions, because of the constant escalations and the compounding problem of destruction and the trauma and everything that had been already building up to that point. And we are now talking about something that had been un- unanticipated by anyone and had placed everyone in such a state of shock that they had now forgotten every other difficulty they had to process this, what they're dealing with now.
In 2003, I was trying to get to Gaza. I was supposed to go and meet Dr. Ayed al-Sarraj, the then director of the Gaza Mental Health Hospital. I ended up doing the interview on the phone, and I'll never forget how he spoke about the high rates of trauma within the Gaza population. And this is over 20 years ago. So I can only imagine
Mm.
how today has affected what is happening on the ground in terms of mental health. In your work, between your writing and the images, your photos seem to have a deeper pull on the public, such as the wounded man with no legs, no thicker than a broomstick, which went viral. I keep thinking about what Ayada Sarraj had told me about the trauma, about the ways in which especially men have had to cope with being virtually in a prison, not only physically in Gaza, but being able to provide for their families. Do you believe that visual storytelling is more effective than data in driving policy change?
Well, I can't be the judge of that. I certainly hope that it contributes to that, and that I think there is a reason that visual storytelling exists, and that it has a different impact on people and on decision makers, hopefully, because ultimately that's why I'm doing the job.
It's a very hard job because you're working for an agency that you worked for in another period when you were with UNRWA, and then UNRWA comes under fire, and every single person in the United Nations, as you're well aware, has become an object of politicization. So, if as an aid worker, when you speak to the suffering, somehow this is being teased out by media pundits as being tendentious, what role should aid workers be playing in Gaza in the face of witnessing the suffering being politicized? It's sort of like if you say that red is red, you're accused somehow of taking the other side. You're being asked to claim that red is blue or something on that order.
Yeah, I think this is a really big challenge in the current age, let's say, of, information from every possible direction. And we've got AI, we've got all kinds of sources that are really overwhelming. And especially given that international journalists are still not allowed in Gaza, you know, you have all these different narratives. Sometimes they're conflicting, sometimes they're complementary, but there's just a barrage of information that becomes very, very difficult for the public to digest. And when humanitarian workers, when the veracity of our reports and our storytelling or claims or whatever it may be, when it comes into question, it just it contributes to the confusion, and it obviously takes away from our ability to really tell the story, and make an impact, a bigger impact, because then when I mean, everything in Gaza is politicized always, and scrutinized and looked at with a microscope. And so it just, obviously, it makes us work harder to make sure that everything that we present and everything that we portray is verified and triple checked and triangulated and whatnot, and it's important. It's more important than ever, now, to make sure that that we continue our work with the level of integrity that we've always had, because we remain the source of information and of accurate information for people, given again that international journalists are barred from being there.
Yeah, I noticed that the UN had to take on this role, this type of role of reporting in the absence of Israel allowing international journalists into the country, which becomes its own paradox because they set all of you up to fail again. The moment you start to report the facts, they accuse the UN of being tendentious or saying you are reporting on things of which you have no knowledge or that you work for Hamas, as they've done with many journalists as well. It seems that the UN agencies have been punished directly by Israel, such as the suspension of food coming into the country, using that puppet Israeli American organization to do food distribution, which proved disastrous. Can you comment about what happened with this situation between UN agencies and the Israeli government? And I know you're not anymore with UNRWA, but I'm wondering what the effect of that type of mini ban, as it were, had on the agency itself.
Well, UNRWA it still is the biggest actor in Gaza, and of course, UNRWA has always depended on their national staff to um, provide the assistance and to provide the services and provide everything that is done in Gaza. But of course, the fact that international staff are not allowed to operate from there anymore is having it complicates things massively. Um, and yeah, UNRWA is an indispensable part of the overall response. So it's any type of restriction that are placed on our ability to respond, whether it be on the types of supplies or the volume of supplies or the organizations being or not being able allowed to work, of course, makes our job so much more difficult. And and to add to that, I was thinking the other day, the toll, again, not just of course, the psychological toll, but the death toll of this war on aid workers is really astounding. I mean, 400, just UN aid workers alone. It's almost four, or it's actually, I think, more than 400 people now. And I can't think of any other conflict where this is the number of aid workers has been the number of aid workers killed in such a short time.
Yes, between aid workers and journalists, it's quite horrific what's going on.
And then, of course, medical workers and healthcare workers and stuff like that.
How many hospitals are operating now in Gaza?
So we have so there are 36 hospitals total. I believe about half of them are operational, but I would need to double check the number. What I can tell you is that despite all the work that we have done with the rehabilitation of the healthcare system and bringing in medicine and all of that, and bringing in whatever equipment that we can, it's still just over 40%, around 42%, I think, of facilities that are functioning currently, healthcare facilities. So it's, the healthcare system really remains in quite dire straits. And of course, most of these facilities are only functioning partially because either there's lack of equipment or lack of, lab testing or lack of specific facilities or lack of space or lack of um, you name it, really. So healthcare is one of the areas that has sustained such massive damage. And if we're talking about healthcare that specifically needed to support patients um, who need to be who cannot get the healthcare inside Gaza. There's 18,000 patients, more than 18,000 patients, waiting currently on the list to be medically evacuated because the healthcare that they need is not available in Gaza. So these 18,000 patients, some of them have already died over these past 2 years while waiting to be evacuated. There's 4,000 children on this list. And this list just, it keeps growing because the number of people that are being evacuated is too small, because also, one of the reasons being because more countries need to come forward and uh, agree to take them to be treated.
Yes, I was reading an article about this just the other day. Israel has the final say then on who gets to leave the country for medical evacuations and who doesn't.
There are specifically about medical evacuations. The main issue that we have is that there are not enough countries to take these patients in. But I mean, of course, Israel is the ultimate. They have control of the crossings, and they have control of who is going in and out.
If Palestinians leave Gaza, are they allowed back in the country?
Well, so we have had, obviously, when Rafah has reopened, we have seen some people returning, which was it was an encouraging um, development. But, as with any crossing, we have said that it has to be a meaningful kind of opening. It shouldn't just be a token kind of opening. So, of course, we want to see more people coming back. We want to see more medical evacuation taking place, and also, ultimately, of course, it needs to be open for cargo, both humanitarian and commercial cargo.
What role now should the UN Secretary Council be playing in ensuring the safety of aid workers like yourself?
Well, the UN, obviously, my job as a UN worker is very separate from what the Security Council decides, and it's not for me to tell them what role they have. They are obviously, everything that we do is usually um, they oversee that we are doing everything in line with humanitarian law, with international law, and of course in line with Security Council resolutions. There's the 2720. There's the resolution on the um, what happens next, and so forth. So yeah.
So, yeah, how do you balance the need for objective reporting with the emotion of seeing unconscionable suffering daily?
Well, I think we report what we see, and our job is to give that report, um, to obviously verify everything that we see and we look at, and we talk everyone that we talk to, and we try to. Again, we have been the source of information for the public, for the decision makers, for the politicians, for whoever it might be. And so, of course, uh, it's a struggle not to let emotions take over. But ultimately, we're there to that is our mantra: is to operate within the humanitarian principles of independence, of neutrality, of humanity, and so forth. So this is what we're trained to do, and this is, of course, reporting on unimaginable suffering is one of our core kind of functions that we have done, and that is exactly what we have to report. That is, it's not for us to say that there is a war, of course, but it is what impact this war is having on the people, on the daily lives of people, and what we can do as humanitarians to change that and to make sure that lives are saved and that more lives are not placed at risk.
Many people have criticized Israel, claiming that the ceasefire is a name only. What have you seen on the ground in recent days and weeks regarding that fact?
So, for weeks and weeks straight, we have seen many, 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 many strikes that continued, that, of course, were costing civilian lives and more damage and so forth. We have seen a slight reduction in this in the last few weeks, but they haven't disappeared, and we still continue to see these strikes, and they are a part of daily lives for the people. So, unfortunately, this is something that hasn't quite translated for the civilians, and of course, what is paramount is protection of civilians, and the fact that civilians continue to pay with their lives is extremely concerning to us.
You often speak to global outfits like CNN and Al Jazeera. What is the one message, or maybe two or three, that you feel the international community still hasn't fully grasped about the situation there?
Well, I think one message is that I think maybe there's two messages. One is that humanitarian assistance is not about food parcels or handing out aid. Humanitarian assistance is about so much more. It's about giving people the dignity that they need to continue their lives. So it's services, it's assistance, it is everything, mental health support, protection, and so on and so forth. A lot of people, when they think about humanitarian assistance, they think just boxes of stuff, and it goes beyond that, and it is something that humanitarians, we've done it for so long, all over the world, and it's a system that has been trusted and tested and used all over the world, and it's something that we, of course, will continue to do. And the second message is that just with the end of a war, or just even a ceasefire to a war, doesn't finish the suffering. It doesn't mean that people's lives go back to normal. It actually a lot of times means that they could get worse, because exactly the public eye is no longer interested, and they turn away and they no longer listen. So it's important to make sure that the focus remains on crises, even after the war is done, or after the guns fall silent, because the suffering of the people may continue for many, many years to come.